We have Mark Rosenblum, Ph.D., Professor of History, Director of the Center for Ethnic and Racial and Religious Understanding. He's also the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies, Queens College, New York. And he will be bringing to us ethno-religious conflict resolution and prevention strategies. Will Mark Rosenblum please rise?
So I have a title for the brief presentation today, which I don't mean to be controversial or to be provocative, but it's the attempt to identify where hope might reside as the modern Middle East is coming apart at its seams. You have states dissolving, most particularly the two that people are concentrating the most on because of the implications of further proliferation, negative proliferation out of Iraq and Syria. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself has never looked grimmer. I think the definition of an optimist in the Middle East today, if you were to follow the editorials or the pages of almost every major newspaper, no matter where you are in the Middle East, is a sense of a Middle Eastern definition of an optimist as an ill-informed pessimist. Things are so gruesome, and the gruesomeness is not only connected to the dissolution of the borders associated with the making of the modern Middle East at the end of World War I, where it's often referred to as the thrice promised land, where there were a series of negotiations, understandings, and agreements that made contradictory promises and ambiguous promises to a series of different parties. And the French and the British were not the only, but they were the major villains in this piece. You had the creation of a significantly accurate representation that colonial cartography is now being undermined in the Middle East. That is, the map that was drawn at the end of World War I was disproportionately influenced, actually constructed by the British and the French with other colonial interests, not always mutually agreeable. They themselves had conflicts, internal conflicts. But that map and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the agreement between the British and the French in particular to develop spheres of influence and direct colonies, is now coming apart. And it's coming apart in a way that is fairly frightening. We no longer, you could argue, have empire, but we also no longer have an umpire. The rules of who is going to help construct the new terrain and the new cartography in the Middle East are plastic. It's silly putty. You don't know for sure if anyone is home. Never have the international machinery look so frail and weak in contending with a regional catastrophe that has immediate global implications that are staggering. And while I will be talking about trying to walk this tightrope of identifying the severity of the barriers to peace and reconciliation in the Middle East, I will be trying to focus on those barriers only so we at least have a feasible, realistic sense of where hope does reside. And I'll be trying to do that in a quirky way, in that I am obsessed with trying to figure out how best to teach people about the Middle East and continue to evolve as a person who thinks they know something. And I will present a model today that I've been working on for 10 years at Queens College, and it now pretends to be a comprehensive, all-embracing model that brings the Middle East systematically, regularly, every week, every day to the Queens College campus, with Israelis, with Palestinians, with Egyptians, with people from Saudi Arabia, from across the Middle East. And they are diplomats, negotiators, present and past. They are religious leaders. They are generals and military leaders. They are grassroots activists that are abhorred at the conditions in their own countries. It brings a broad band of people to the Middle East. And I've constructed a curriculum that tries to take advantage, first, of the laboratory I am fortunate enough to have to do something like this. The laboratory is the borough of Queens, which is probably the most diverse place in the United States in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religiosity, in terms of identity structure that has got some collective basis for it. I have in my class that I cap at 20. Now this semester I took in 30. I capped it at 30. Those 30 students between them speak 82 languages. I have students in my class, 5 of them, that speak Farsi, Hebrew, and Arabic fluently. It's a place where there are 140 languages that are spoken, and every country in the United Nations, every 193 of them is represented on our campus. And many of them have enough presence numerically, demographically, to really count for something on the campus. If you have 200 or 300 students from Egypt or from Syria, and we have massive flight from Syria, and not all Syrians are going to Jordan. Not all Syrians are going to Turkey. Some of them are coming to New York. This is a class issue. Most of those who make it to the United States have kith and kin here and have some resources to do that. So the laboratory is magnificent if we're talking about the assets and the potential liabilities that comes with this diversity. And so I'm going to say a few more words about the magnitude of the crisis of the Middle East, and then I'm going to dip into what I think is a model curriculum that I'm still learning from other people. I've done this only because I have a very, very gifted student I taught at the New School for Social Research, and someone that was in a doctoral program and took a simulation about the Middle East for me, and she's an actress and a performer. And she has incredible skills in how to construct simulations where students play roles. And so I draw on people that have all kinds of skills and knowledge that I can't dream of. So I don't pretend this is mine. It is a group's. And while I'm the principal and my name, unfortunately, is too much in the news as the representative of the Center for Jewish Studies, or CIRU, the Center for Ethnic, Racial, and Religious Understanding, this is a collective group enterprise. And it starts with the very first day, the idea of students in a class that has been transparently advertised for what it is. If you take this course, you will be walking in the shoes of that ethnic, national, or religious group whose pains and claims you know the least about and you have the least sympathy for. This is a role-playing experience where you're required for 16 weeks to understand the other in your life. So it's a course on Israeli and Palestinian, and you identify with Israel, you identify with Palestine. You are immediately given an essay questionnaire that is so self-revealing of where your community of commitment is, who you identify with, whose pains and claims you identify as your own. You can leave the course, but we try and pre-select and make sure that this is a learning community that is as diverse as the campus. So we make sure we have Orthodox Jewish students. Now we have ultra-Orthodox Jewish students. We have students in a term that's also all used in Israel that may not be familiar, the Haredis, that don't believe in a Jewish state of Israel. They're not Zionist. They're very religious, and their day schools have often bellied up and gone bankrupt in the last 2 years or priced themselves out of the market. And many of those students are coming to Queens College as if it's a Torah academy. And I make sure we have some of those students in my class. We have Orthodox, modern Orthodox Jewish students in our class. We have secular Jews in our class. We have Bukharian Jews that came from a part of the former Soviet Union. We have 1,000 Bukharian Jewish students at Queens College. Probably you never even heard of them. We have the broadband of who is a Jew at Queens College. We could have 4 civil wars if we wanted to arm people in a linguistic exaggeration. These are people that disagree with each other on pretty profound issues of religion, on questions of values even, their interpretation of what Jewish values that are meaningful to them. So we try and do the same thing with the Muslim students on campus. And those that are religious identify, are very active in the Muslim Student Association that is built right into my class. Every class has pretty much close to a third Jewish students, all different religious and secular persuasions, 1/3 Christian students, 1/3 I said Jewish, Christian, and Muslim students. Those three equally broken. And we also encourage, you don't have to be one of these three monotheistic religions. You can be of any religion or not religion, but the class is heavily tilted in terms of who comes to it. And these are not all liberal, touchy-feely, let's love each other. These are people I don't have to disarm in class and search for ordinance, but these are people that are really coming to try and understand something about their own persuasion. And it takes courage to do that. But they're going to have to walk in the other side's shoes to hopefully learn more about themselves and their own community of commitment. So this community of commitment has another difference besides different ethnic, religious, and even racial orientation. It has intergenerational. We also bring in 7 to 9 senior citizens that represent the same adult faith communities, often non-governmental people active in non-governmental organizations and their commitment, their community commitment. And we have one 95-year-old person in the class this semester that's a Holocaust survivor. We have 2 others that are second-generation Holocaust survivors. We have people we have a man today who's 82 years old from Jaffa who talks about having been expelled forcibly from his community as a Palestinian Muslim. So we have a very diverse community, even in terms of generational. And then we bring in teachers. We've trained 250 teachers in the public school system that are mandated to teach a course in the Middle East. And schools like Forest Hills High School, typical of the 8 schools we're most involved in, has a very large population of Israeli mothers and fathers and recent immigrants and people who have come for a period of time to live in the States from Israel. And we have a very significant Egyptian population, Muslim Egyptian population there, and others. And the teachers are afraid of getting their head handed to them because they are walking on explosions if they don't handle the Middle East in a way that the kids, when they go home and talk about what they're reading and learning, so the teachers are looking for some edifying, some grounding that gives them facts or opinions that seem as if they're plausible and will help them get through the week without the diaspora mothers and fathers coming in from Egypt and Israel and wanting to make an appointment with Mrs. Cohn or Mrs. Nashwa. So we have a community that is very broad and learns together. Now, what do we learn? Besides the experiment of a very diverse community, they learn with Israelis. They learn with Palestinians. They learn with Egyptians. They learn with Iranians that are living in this country. We've also managed to do a couple of interesting things with Iranian artists that have gotten visas into the country. They learn with people from the Middle East. And what they have to do, as I've intimated already, and I'll now get to this first slide, this is something that my students understand is central to the way that this class is run. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Contradiction, learning about another narrative that's contradictory to your own, another set of values and beliefs. You have to try and hold these together. And one should, for example, be able to see things as hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. The title of my presentation today is Things Are Dreadful in the Middle East. For states, for movements, for peace, for moderation. We're in a great colossal meltdown here. And the latest force on the block that you've been hearing pretty much only about, maybe if you were watching sharply on media June 10th, when Mosul fell to ISIS, this organization that is supposedly a mass murderous organization that gives other Muslims a choice of converting to their stream of Islam or die. So they give a choice to somebody. And this organization has captured everyone's fancy and fear. In the Middle East, Obama is now back in the skies of Iraq and back in the skies of Syria. A presidency that was built on ending the projection and perception of America being an empire has failed. And he is now back in the same muddle East militarily, and the head of the Republican Party in the Congress left town like all of our distinguished representatives are doing without talking about or issuing to dare to vote about what's happening in American foreign policy. And the head of this Republican Congress says, we must have boots on the ground. It's not just air. There's enough fear about this that politicians think they actually can benefit from saying boots on the ground, yet American public is nowhere near this. So ISIS has really captured people's attention in a very, very dramatic way. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at in this hopelessness is not only holding contradictory ideas, the students are going to be challenged to do that, they're going to first be tested on their level of curiosity. This comes from someone, a photographic journalist and a very gifted artist that we work with in our program, George Lewis. He captured this picture of a bikini and something else. And if you looked at this picture close up, you will see both heads as they pass on this beach are slightly tilted looking at the other. They're curious. They're not about to fall in love. They're probably not about to have a serious friendship, but they're curious about each other. And curiosity is a central instinct that we want to encourage in our students. Do not be afraid to have a conversation, to have more than a glancing look at someone that looks very different than you. And I'll be saying a lot in a few minutes about faith and fabric and how we use it in our class. The second picture is a picture also by George Lewis, taken in Saudi Arabia in a starlit night. And you see flames of natural gas, and you see big, huge, giant buildings that are skyscrapers everywhere. Some of the taller buildings in the world, not just Abu Dhabi and Dubai, have these huge, towering, monumental architecture pieces. Saudi Arabia has this too. You have a camel in the front. You have this collision between modernity and tradition is meant to be suggested by George Lewis here. This is the one thing that we pine for. Our class has a very comprehensive curriculum of a very diverse community in all ways, generationally, ideologically, ethnically, religiously. And we have high school teachers and high school students that are now a multiplier force that come to our class, and we go to the high schools. We've trained 250 teachers in this curriculum, and they've taken our courses and developed age, grade appropriate, walk in the other side shoes courses for high school students. So it seems great, but we're missing something. If we go back to that last slide, the goal for the last 10 years is to figure out not how we bring the Middle East to us for an authentic, serious look at the Middle East, finding hope at a time in cholera, but to get to the region, to smell the flowers, to walk in the sand, to go to Tel Aviv, to go to Riyadh in the same trip, to go to 7 Arab countries and territories for 6 weeks together with the best and brightest students in the United States majoring in Middle Eastern studies that speak languages and have never been to the Middle East. And that is what's coming down the pike in this curriculum, the successful now creation of a program that takes our students and other students from Yale, from Berkeley, from Penn, from universities around the United States, those that are qualified, to 6 weeks in the Middle East with me, and we try and extend our knowledge base by spending time in the Middle East. So this is one of the, we're skipping now 2 slides. If you can skip and I'll go to the next one after this one. The most curious part of our curriculum is this, what I mentioned earlier. There's a necessity for 16 weeks you're going to walk in the other side's shoes. You will fill a questionnaire out that clearly reveals what your preordained assumptions are and how you think the solutions of the conflict could be. You declare in this essay very transparently whose pains and claims you're a part of, what's your community of commitment. And now you are required to walk in the other side's shoes. And I'm very careful. What I believe, my values, my politics, my students can Google me and they will find I'm very actively involved. I don't consider myself only a semi-scholar. I also am very involved. I founded 3 NGOs in the Middle East. My name is all over the place associated with a tendency. I check my tendency at the gates. My goal is to have the students learn the best case possible of every significant side in the conflict. And so the student will be required now, and this is the famous quote that maybe some of you who are fans of this particular author, the teacher who is indeed wise does not bid you to enter the house of his or her wisdom, but rather leads you to the to the threshold of your own mind. I am not trying to convert people to what I think. I'm trying to get them to see the broad band of sentiments that exist in a conflict in each side, because none of these communities are monolithic, even the ones that you think are totalitarian or so repressive that there's no other thought pattern or no opposition. There are oppositions. Makes a difference which country you're in, how open and effective you can be. Or we use the Pirkei Avot, who is wise, according to this very famous book of the rabbis and the forefathers of Judaism. Who is wise? One who learns from everyone. So this idea of open-minded, open-heartedness is a requirement in the class, and you're now going to study for 16 weeks, if you're studying about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you're going to study with Palestinian scholars from Palestine. You're going to study with military officers from the Palestinian Authority. You're going to meet with religious leaders from Palestine. You're going to study with educators who teach at one of the colleges, perhaps the largest college or municipal institution in East Jerusalem, which is Al-Quds University. You will learn for 16 weeks their narrative. And the goal, now go back to the three little pigs. When looking at the narrative of the other side, your responsibility is to build the best case statement possible. You'll be graded after 16 weeks in your narrative about the other side, whether you are the little piggy that built a house of straw. Piggy is not good for Jews and Muslims, but they're little pigs. And a house of bricks, that's the one we want. The wood is not good even. So we're looking for the best case statement you can make about the other. You're not building straw man cases that are easy to blow over here. This is one of the golden rules, and they have to, every 2 weeks, present another element of their case statement, and they're reminded of the house of brick. If there's a titanium house you can build that. The next slide is be careful. Be careful about buying or selling half a rug. And one of my recent missions to Syria 3.5 years ago was the last mission. I actually took some people into Syria, and I was nuts enough to go, and nuts enough to have some people that wanted to go at the beginning of the struggle in Syria that was just about starting to turn violent. That is, the opposition from the army that was breaking from Assad and the Alawite regime was now starting to get arms and decided they could not survive this massacre. They had to use arms in a non-violent protest, would not work with this regime. And one of the rugs that one of my very wealthy clients wanted to buy was a rug. He bought about $30,000 worth of carpets, and the last one he grabbed on the way in, he loved the half he saw. He took it home, and it had the portrait of a very famous Christian Palestinian negotiator and educator, Hanan Ashrawi, on it. He didn't want to have her on the wall. He didn't bother to look out and roll the entire rug. This is true of education and knowledge as well. All of us have a tendency to buy or sell half a rug. Deeper analysis does not necessarily lead to political paralysis. Take the risk of looking at the whole rug. Make sure you're buying something and seeing all of it. The students talk a lot about this metaphor in building their case statement for the other side. Next one, please, sorry. Beyond that, this is, you can't see it, the lights, but this is the group of 14 people that I took this past summer. And you'll see some are by fashion Muslim and some are Jews. You can't see the abayas or the kippas in this picture, but we'll talk about that. They're from Penn, this particular group that was selected from Berkeley, California, from University of Pennsylvania, from Syracuse, 3 from Queens College, 1 from New Haven and Yale. Nashwa El Said is a woman that was abducted when she was 2 years old from her father, by her father, who was married to a Hispanic woman here. And he took her at 2 and took her to Alexandria, Cairo, where she was raised as a Muslim woman and was used and abused in all ways imaginable. And at the age of 16, he told her that a marriage had been arranged for her. That was it. She had gotten into contact with the U.S. Embassy several years earlier, trying to figure out how she could escape the wrath and the visibility of her father to escape. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and she was willing to risk everything in an attempted flight that succeeded. She came to Queens College when she was 17 and a half years old. She had learned some English through spaghetti cowboy English movies, and I think the Beastly Boys or Beast Boys. I'm revealing my ignorance and age. So she had some English under her belt, and she's a remarkable, brilliant, and energetic woman that freed herself and is now fighting for others. She works with me as my colleague in running this program that we have at Queens College, and now it has a component in the Middle East that I'll talk about very briefly, because this program that I said was lacking. It was lacking authenticity, even legitimacy in my mind, that we weren't able to go to the Middle East with these students. As much as I tried to bring these wonderful, diverse group of Israelis from all around the Middle East, and nobody else was quite having that reach of contacts, bringing all these people in from Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Palestine, we were missing the air, the sand, the sights, the politics that you have to experience. And so we went from a month together from awesome Petra in Jordan. We spent 2 days in Petra watching one of the miracles of the world. This is a canyon view to the gruesome, from the awesome to the gruesome. The Islamic State's army occupation of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, June 10th. That's a body and blood. It's an army now of probably 50,000 if you talk to serious intelligence people, that is growing geometrically on a weekly basis. Massive recruits, a whole nother story here. Their story, their experiences went from awesome to gruesome. And this is a trip where they captured the real Middle East, maybe hope without delusion. A few things about the trip. Faith and fabric. Probably one of the most important highlights of this trip was possible because of the diversity that's built into it. We had 3 students that were Jewish Orthodox, one that was flamingly, virulently anti-clerical and anti-religious, 3 Orthodox Jews, and one that was secular and had an anti-religious, strong anti-religious sentiment. We had 4 Muslim students. We had 3 Christian students. We had 1 Indian student. And we're going to see one of the most powerful things that we discovered has to do with the fabric and the way you reveal your identity. And I want to do this really quickly. This is the Muslim woman who had probably the most vibrant story in our trip. She's from the University of Pennsylvania. She's outed already in terms of media and is telling her story. So she can be named. Famida is a University of Pennsylvania student in pre-med and minoring in political science. And the other student you're about to see now is Daniel, who's an Orthodox Jewish student who lost his luggage when he got to Oman. And he decided that he would, under his kippah, put an Omani hat and he wore an Omani outfit. So he borrowed an identity and dressed as an Omani. So he is very religious. He's probably the most orthodox, ritually honoring orthodoxy of any student I've ever had at Queens College. And he lost his luggage and wore this to an evening with the second the most powerful person, only second to the Sultan, in his palace, and wore this. And said hello in Arabic and spoke in Arabic. He's fluent, obviously, in Hebrew. And his family lives in Shiloh, a Jewish settlement in the West Bank. His politics are very sympathetic to Jewish settlers. So we have some fabric things going on here with risk-taking. But the most interesting story that we're coming to, probably on this trip, is Orthodox Jewish American. You can't see his kippah unless you look very closely. He's in downtown Tel Aviv. And downtown Tel Aviv is very cosmopolitan. And it doesn't have the same religious tone and feel and environment as Jerusalem. It's completely different. And many Jerusalemites consider it a primitive heathen city. There are some shuls and mosques and synagogues you can go to, which my Orthodox students found and went to. But it has a feeling of a very open city, but it was also in many cases quite xenophobic and very critical of, again, the woman that's on a back. This is not a bike that's built for 2. She's not pedaling. She's sitting on the fender. He decides, he loves bikes, he decides to borrow a bike and to ride for 2 hours down the streets of Tel Aviv. Both of them said this was the highlight of the trip for them because she knew and he knew she was being abused and she was being criticized. Almost every day there was an incident of someone saying something to her that was not just inappropriate, it was really aggressive, it was incitement. And he wanted to make a point. He wanted to make a point as a Jewish man. He's with a Muslim woman on this bike. And they drove around Tel Aviv, and at the end there were 300 people around them wanting to talk and learn who they were. Because it's not a thing you see, even though there are significant numbers of Muslims, including Muslim citizens of the State of Israel, Arab Muslims in the State of Israel. But you don't find this kind of collegiality and showing of fabric and faith, riding a bike that's not designed for two, but turning it into. And this became an important metaphor of the trip. You turn the bike into something that it's not supposed to do. The fender had to be repaired. They repaired it. So the bike went back in working order, and they created positive disorder. We went to a Palestinian refugee camp, Jalazon. It's right near the Mokata, the Palestinian national headquarters near Ramallah. 5 minutes? 2 minutes? Okay, I'm going to finish in 2 minutes. This as the second really important highlight that gives you a feel of what the students experienced. They went to a Palestinian refugee camp, and this is right on the cusp of the war, the 50-day war between Gaza and Israel, in which 2,100 Palestinians were killed. At least that's the numbers the United Nations has, and the Palestinian medical authorities reported to the United Nations. The Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli Minister of Health is now going through another count because they understood in this war that is considered an asymmetrical war, Hamas did not fight with uniforms. How do you separate the fighters from the civilians to get a number that's credible? So this is a very controversial issue of what the evidence is in the heat of a fog of war to make calls that are certain. But in this camp was already burning. And you see the most important Palestinian graphic artist and cartoonist is telling you what he thinks. If you were to dim the lights, you have a Palestinian character, Handala, and he's known by every Palestinian. His back is turned to you. He's got a key. The key opens up his house in Israel that was confiscated ostensibly by the Zionist movement. It's insisting on the right to return to a home in territory in the state of Israel. And you see over here Palestine, which is Israel, and the West Bank is Palestine, is surrounded by barbed wires. He's a very important, very charismatic, and very significant influencer of emotion and of tendencies. And he is everywhere, including in this camp, with illustrations everywhere. Right after this, we understood how important the right to return the refugee issue was and how hard it was going to be to negotiate peace. Now, if I go to the next slide, this is something this is a table from the most important study ever done by the most important Palestinian researcher on the refugee issue, a man named Khalil Shikaki. Here's a table here. I'll translate it. This table says, of all of the Palestinian refugees, in the biggest survey ever done of Palestinian refugees, and they're given 5 choices of how they end their refugee status. 10% of them choose as their first choice using that key and going back to a house that doesn't exist, to a village that doesn't exist, to a mosque that doesn't exist. 10% most want to go back to a future Palestinian state in the West Bank, in the Israeli called administered territories or part of Judea and Samaria, which most of the rest of the world and very large number of Israelis call occupied territories. Most are saying they go back to occupied territories and they wouldn't go. The number 10% then shrinks to 2% of the refugees as their first choice want to use their key when they're told their house doesn't exist. Ashkelon is now the city where one of your 14 villages were. And it's got 96% of the citizens are Jews. And you're returning to that city without a home, without a village, and in a Jewish demographic majority place. They choose, the number goes from 10% to 2%. The right to return in a refugee camp looks as if it's a deal record. There's nothing to talk about. Then you go to a scholar who studied this and he says, it may be doable if the Israelis were to really provide for a contiguous territorial state living in peace next to Israel. in the West Bank with a connecting road to the Gaza Strip, and if the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were reunified, and the Israeli settlements stopped and were significantly, if not entirely, removed to other places. I have lots of other news here. I have to end. I've used up my time. From my vantage point, my students learn what the barriers and the bridges are to a breakthrough in a substantive Israeli-Palestinian negotiation. They don't simply want to, they can't be told what the bridges are without the barriers. And you can't just leave it with the barriers and talk about peace being impossible. Peace is neither impossible or inevitable. It is contingent. And the issue is for the students to figure out what are the contingencies and to what extent they fit into the contingencies that could deliver a substantive breakthrough to peace. And I'll have to stop there.